Hey everyone, so just recently during an interview, Sony Interactive Entertainment President and CEO Jim Ryan said, "Content is becoming more important than ever before," and this is in reference to the increased competition in gaming, like Google Stadia coming in for example. But he was more or less reaffirming what they've said prior, which is that they are looking into acquiring more studios. Now that's good news, but let's really digest this. Who would they buy and why? So in the interest of covering a topic that's more recent, but also cutting down on how long Let's Talk PlayStation has been getting, because it's 20 minutes now almost every single week, and we're covering multiple news stories there. I'm sorry about that. Some of you enjoy that, but we'll try and find a good balance. Either way, this has been a very hot topic lately, especially since this is 2 times now where Sony has said that they are definitely looking into acquiring more studios. Well, actually, the first time they said this, it was a matter of 2 ways. Acquiring a new studio, or possibly doing it organically, which would be they could purpose build a studio like they did with Superbot Entertainment for PlayStation All-Stars Battle Royale. Some of you may remember that. Or one of their internal teams could split off and form another studio that way. So that's very possible as well. But there's a lot of avenues where it can really go. And Sony also confirmed that they're doing major, big publisher deals moving forward for the next generation PlayStation. That's going to be very important for them. And they're actually even distancing themselves from independent developers, which could be a separate video in itself. But that'll kind of go into what we're talking about here, because that's the thing about what studios Sony will buy. That's the conversation, right? Maybe they should buy this developer or this developer. They should, buy these guys because they work with them so frequently, or their games do so well on PlayStation. But we really have to discuss who's a good client for PlayStation now, who's up to be possibly acquired, who fits the bill, because Sony has a much different requirement nowadays with the worldwide studios, namely that they have this reputation now of delivering massive, big budget, narrative driven games that are just monumental, right? I mean, these games have a very large impact on the industry now, and it really has solidified this reputation that Sony has with their exclusives. It's kind of a big deal, so I don't think this is a situation they really take lightly nowadays, especially since they haven't purchased a developer in such a long time. And so we really are in a place now where I don't think they'd be interested in buying something that's more smaller scale, like say Giant Sparrow, for example. Now they've released great games on PlayStation, but considering the way Sony's been talking lately about smaller developers, that might not be a situation where they're really keen to bring them on. Now, it's weird because it's a double-edged sword. They still do have developers under their suite right now, where it's like Sony London Studio doing VR titles, or Japan Studio pumping out every so often these really weird niche titles. We do have the developer of Entwine, that's pixelopus, and they're doing Concrete Genie. So yeah, we've got some weird, more obscure titles that don't necessarily appeal to a wide variety of gamers, and more so a smaller subset of people, but they probably do want to focus PlayStation in terms of really getting these big budget games and showing people, whoa, I definitely have to own a PlayStation over, say, streaming games on Google Stadia or buying the next gen Xbox. That's what Jim Ryan's talking about. Content is so important. So I really think they're going to focus on big developers, somebody that's really going to fit in nicely amongst the ranks of, say, Naughty Dog, Santa Monica Studio, Guerrilla Games, the usual suspects. These are the developers that are really making a big name for PlayStation nowadays, and that's why I think 10 years ago you had this situation where Sony had all these developers that, they were doing games that people thoroughly enjoyed, and it sucked that some of these developers closed, like Guerrilla Cambridge or big studios. Zephyr was a tough one to lose for sure, but a lot of the times they were pumping out games that just didn't appeal to a wider audience nowadays, and they were just appealing to a smaller group of people over time with every subsequent release. Now, you could also argue that they put them on buzz projects, and that's all well and good, but that's the direction that they have left behind them nowadays. So moving forward, who are they looking at now? Who would be a good candidate to join the worldwide studios at Sony? Now, Insomniac Games is one that always comes up a lot. The thing about Insomniac Games that some of you may not know, they don't really want to be acquired. They've probably denied Sony a number of times. The conversations there have certainly taken place, and that's even with situations where they've done Ratchet and Clank for Sony for so long. They've done Resistance. They recently did Marvel Spider-Man. They're probably going to do another sequel to the game, certainly, just based off of how well it did. But that's just Insomniac's history. Sure, they're doing a lot of second-party exclusives. They did with Microsoft, with Sunset Overdrive, but there was a period where, right after they shipped Resistance 3, they wanted to go independent. They wanted to own their own IP. That's when they did Fuse, and they did a bunch of, I believe, some social games, maybe mobile games on Facebook or something. Nobody really knows about that because nobody cares about those games. They probably did a little bit of VR stuff in between. Fuse, of course, bombed commercially, and then they signed up with Microsoft for Sunset Overdrive, and now they're with Sony again doing Spider-Man. But they are in a place where they just don't really want, and they probably still don't want to be acquired. So Insomniac Games, as it stands, I still feel as though they're probably off the table. The big recent development, though, is Remedy Entertainment, because Remedy, oh boy, we talked about this on Let's Talk PlayStation 2, which is that just recently, not only did Sony Worldwide Studios head Shuhei Yoshida visit Remedy, but some of the guys at Remedy visited Naughty Dog. Now that's a big red flag right there, well, in a good way, which is that, you know, typically when we have these site visits back and forth, that really tells you that something's going on there. Now Sony has marketing rights for their upcoming game Control, which is launching in the later half of August, and that's fine. But the recent development that we can talk about here is that Remedy recently got the publishing rights back from Microsoft for Alan Wake. So that game was under Microsoft, more or less. So now the IP is completely back in Remedy's hands, and they've even confirmed just recently that in theory, now that they have the IP back, they could certainly release it on multiple platforms if they want to. This is, you can certainly see this in motion now. What's going on here? The conversations are taking place. I think it's easy to pick up what they're laying down here, which is that in some way, shape, or form, we could see Alan Wake get ported to PlayStation 4 or PlayStation 5 or what have you, right? But I think there's something greater in motion here, which is that maybe there is a discussion of an inquirement going on. And I think Remedy is actually a developer that probably could very much so be in that place. They might have a vertical slice of a project that they've been working on. They've showed that to Sony. Sony's very interested, and going into the next generation PlayStation, they've perhaps laid an offer out on the table. Maybe they've raised that capital to possibly get that IP back. We don't necessarily know what's going on there. We know that they recently got paid a big royalty from their previous released games, so that's good for them, but you can see what's going down here. So Remedy, as of right now, looks very good in terms of possibly joining the worldwide studios at Sony, but who else, really? There was also the example of Housemarque Games. Sony recently visited them as well, and Housemarque was always well known for some of those arcadey games, really great games, but those are games that Housemarque has now left behind, and they're doing something more substantial, a little bit different, free-to-play games, Battle Royale style games with their upcoming title, but they also have a AAA game that is unannounced and they're working on right now. That might be another situation where they have a slice of that game that they've demonstrated to Sony, and Sony really liked it, and now a conversation might be happening there as well as possibly joining Worldwide Studios. The thing is, with Housemarque, I'm not quite a believer in this just yet. Now, I love Housemarque games, and I love some of their twin-stick shooters, but this would be their first big-budget game that they're actually working on. We have no idea what it is. We have no idea what it looks like. It's very much so a possibility that it is something substantial, and it will be fantastic, but it is something new for them, so who knows how that turns out. Like I said earlier, Sony is in a place right now where they're kind of walking away from these smaller devs, and we can talk about that later in terms of how they're like treating them, because it's such a kind of a 180 from the early PS4 reveal and the early PS4 years where they were all about indies, and now that's not really the case moving forward. I think that is kind of important going into PS5, is that sure, you could have all these smaller scale independent games on your platform, but they're probably going to try and release everywhere because that's kind of what they do, and you really do want a handful of major titles that will really convince somebody to say, you know what, I need a PlayStation Now subscription, I need a PlayStation 5, or however they decide to approach releasing that next-gen console. There's a lot of people that are making a good argument for IO Interactive or 4A Games. That's Hitman or Metro right there. They've got some good IP under their belt. I think those are franchises, and the type of projects that they do that could certainly find their place in Sony's lineup. There's also Bungie, for example, which that's a little bit outlandish, and that really wouldn't be a scenario where that would even take place either. They're very much so like Insomniac, where they got away from being owned. They want to be independent, and they just recently walked away from Activision, so that's not really going to happen. But there's the conversation of something very disruptive. So like doing something like Bungie would stir the pot, no doubt. And there's a lot of Japanese developers that could stir the pot as well. The conversations of Sony buying out SEGA, purchasing Atlas for the Persona franchise and all the other games that they do. That also would it would cause some noise, maybe not that much noise as something as big as Bungie, but there's also Level 5 that they could look into. I think that would probably be one of the better ways for Sony to kind of demonstrate that they're not walking away from Japanese developers, because as of recent they've been certainly under fire there, with a lot of Japanese devs being frustrated with Sony's new policies regarding sexual content in games. So that could be another thing that they could possibly do. And yes, these are smaller scale games at heart, but Sony could maybe have a strategy going forward where they'd purchase two developers, right? So one that does line up well with Naughty Dog, Sony Santa Monica, Guerrilla Games, and then one that more in line of Sony London Studio or Pixel Opus, Sony Japan Studio, because they still do those games as well. So You know, I think they're trying to find a good balance and just not have developers like we've talked about before, where Big pumps out, you know, kind of this really weird, obscure game that only a handful of people really buy. Now, Big's last years, Zipper's last years, were really putting out games on PlayStation Vita, which was a platform inherently not going to sell that many copies of their games anyway, because the Vita wasn't doing all that well to begin with. But again, they're not looking to do games like that anymore. Blue Point Games probably makes a lot of sense just to lock them down, to keep doing remasters of PlayStation content so they don't have to do contract work that ties up what they could possibly be doing for PlayStation, because they just do a bunch of remasters and things like that, but they do fantastic remasters nonetheless, so they are very important. They could have a place in Sony's lineup just to constantly pump out these incredible games from, you know, 15-20 years ago that find new life on PlayStation. I think it would be very important to have something like them locked into just PlayStation content, because they do contract work for tons of other developers and publishers, so at times they'll do other IP as well, so get them locked down just to do PlayStation stuff. That'd be good. There's From Software is another pretty big one that would be a very substantial get for Sony. That's one where it's more unrealistic. That goes in line with like Square Enix, for example, where people want Sony to buy Square Enix. You can't. It's almost like they're not even up for conversation, really. It would just be too crazy. That's too crazy at that point. Developers like Supermassive Games and Quantic Dream, where they do those interactive, very story-heavy games. If Sony wanted to acquire one of them, I think it would have happened by now, whether it's one or the other, not wanting to be acquired or Sony not offering enough money on the table. It's just a situation where I think Sony's fine walking away from those developers and letting them release multi-platform at this point, so that kind of explains them. Then there's Ready at Dawn. They did have a good working relationship there with their PSP games, and then doing the Order 1886 in 2015, but because of how that game did, I think the door is really closed on any possible acquirement going on there. So when people bring up Ready at Dawn, while we would love to give them a second chance, and we would love to see another sequel to The Order where they could probably rectify a lot of the problems from the original game, I don't think that's really going to happen, or I don't think that's on the cards right now. But that's what makes this discussion, I think, more complicated than people think, because I don't want to make a video where I just run off a list of developers and say, oh yeah, this would be good, this would be good, this would be good. No, what's realistic? What's Sony really looking at? What would make a lot of sense? And that's what we're really trying to zero in on. And I think that is where they stand right now, which is that they want to find a good balance with not only having these massive games that create so much buzz and consumer mindset about having to get into PlayStation for those amazing, incredible experiences like the next Horizon, the next Last of Us, the next God of War, but also offering games where developers have this creative vision and creative freedom to explore, you know, different avenues of game development, which is projects like Dreams or Concrete Genie. I know we're also avoiding Kojima at this point. That one seems a bit more precautionary for both parties, which is that, you know, Death Stranding still hasn't shipped yet. I think Sony wants to see the performance of that game. I think Kojima wants to see how that working relationship continues while shipping Death Stranding, because who knows if he's really into having his studio being purchased again. So I think that's kind of where that stands right now. But anyway, I think we should end the conversation there, because yeah, I'm looking at the little counter. Yeah, it's going off way too long. I'm sorry. I know I just complained earlier that the videos are too long, but I talk too much apparently. So I hope you enjoyed the conversation, though. By all means, let me know what you think. What developers do you think Sony will purchase? And as always, we'll cover up some more news stories on Friday for Let's Talk PlayStation, because certainly we'll be discussing Sony CEO Kenichiro Yoshida discussing the PS5 strategy and how he actually called the gaming console niche, which I think is a bit weird, but we will get to the weeds of that on Friday. Anyway, that's about it for me in this video. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you all in my next one. You take it easy.